afternoon, everyone. This is our PhD coursework session number 24. Welcome all the participants and welcome today's resource person, Professor Kamlakar Bhat sir. I am here to introduce him. Kamlakar Bhat is professor and head of the postgraduate department of English and Research Center of Ahmednagar College, Ahmednagar. He is bilingual writer and translator between English, Hindi, Urdu, Marathi, and Kannada. He has published 3 collections of poems in Kannada: Churupuru Reshim, Silk Shreds, Putina Hour 2006, Mugiyada Madhyan, Endless Noon 2010, and Jag Da Jate Matukate, A Chat with the World 2017. His translation of the works of Marathi poet Namdev Dasal has been published by Kuvempu Bhasha Bharati in 2018. Akka Pakkada Patarangiti, Neighboring Butterflies, an anthology of poetry translated from 10 Indian languages, was published in 2021 by the publication division of Kuvempu University, Shivamogga. He has edited the lectures and essays of Professor H.S. Shivaprakash under the title The World and the World, which has been published by Manipal University Press in 2019. He has co-edited an anthology of world poetry titled Sangam, published by Sankathana Press, Mandya. He has translated several modern Kannada poets, some of which have appeared in Indian literature: Muse India, Sesara, the Bombay Literary Magazine, Indian Cultural Forum, Outlook, Guptagu, the Wheel Wagon and Prologue. He has also translated short stories and essays from Kannada into English. He has translated poetry from English, Marathi, Hindi, and Urdu into Kannada, some of which have also been published in many Kannada magazines. He has written columns in Kannada magazines like Andolana, Kenda Samping, and Edina.com. He has published more than 25 research papers in national and international academic journals such as South Asian Review, Pittsburgh, USA, Nidan, South Africa, Intersections, Canberra, Australia, LitCrit, India, Journal of the School of Letters, JNU, Delhi, Literaria, New Delhi, the Atlantic Literary Review, New Delhi, the Journal of Contemporary Literature, New Delhi. He has been bestowed with the Putina Award 2006 and B.H. Sridhar Award 2023 for his creative writing. He is currently in contract with Sahitya Academy for the translation of a collection of poems by the Marathi poet Anuradha Patil into Kannada, and with Ashoka University for the translation of the essays of Kirtinath Kurtapkoti into English. He has been writing regularly in magazines such as Indian Literature, Muse India, Outlook, The Wire In, Scroll In, Kitab Organization, the Bengaluru Review, and Seminar. Today, Professor Bhat is going to deal with the topic Culture Studies, Literature and Memory under specific course Approach to Literature. I hereby request Professor Dr. Bhat sir to lead the session forward. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Vape, and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank the principal of Mula Education Society, Sunai College, and the head of its Department of English, Professor Vape, for giving me this opportunity to share my ideas with the participants of the PhD coursework being conducted by the Department of English, and therefore I thank my friend and my senior colleague, Professor Machindra Vape, for giving me this opportunity. I'm indeed happy to be a part of this PhD coursework and to be able to connect with all of you. My topic for today's presentation is cultural studies, but within cultural studies, I would like to focus more specifically on what may be called as, or what is being called in the recent past as memory studies. Now, cultural studies is an area of relatively recent interest, but widely known. Though truly beginning, uh, the beginning of cultural studies goes back to at least 19th century. Matthew Arnold, to be specific, from whom the modernist critics such as Eliot and F.R. Lewis were inspired. What we today identify as cultural studies is very different from the kind of interest in culture that these writers had. I'm sorry. So what we today identify as cultural studies, which I'm sure all of you have already are familiar with, and perhaps some of you have been working in that field, is the institutional, cultural studies, which was launched by the Birmingham School, as I'm sure all of you are aware. It's a broadly Marxist approach, and gradually came under the influence of French post-structuralism in 1990s. Primarily, and forgive me for repeating something so well known, cultural studies expands the object of literary criticism to include not only texts, but also the diverse phenomena that participate in the production, distribution, and consumption of texts and other products of culture. For example, New Historicism asserts that literary studies should be interested in not only textuality, but also historicity of texts, or post-colonialism focuses on political economy of textual practices. Before I proceed further, I must point out to all of you, the participants in this PhD coursework, that you are most welcome to ask me questions. And maybe because this kind of a distant connection that we have, the impersonal and online connection that we have, in order for it to work better, you can, if you like, you can ask me questions even by using the chat mode. You can type your questions, and I will take them up whenever I see those questions. But I will otherwise, I will take all the questions together at the end. Please don't hesitate to ask questions unrelated to my topic today, which is literature and memory. If you would like me to, speak the relevance of my presentations to the areas of your interest, I would very much be interested in knowing, that kind of comments, listening to your comments about your own field in connection with the topic that I'm discussing today. Now, so all these ideas about the nature of cultural studies, I'm sure, is already known to all of you. Now, if I try to describe what cultural studies is, it will perhaps be redundant. Further, merely explaining the field will be a superficial kind of a lecture, fit only for maybe undergraduate or postgraduate students. It will not serve any of the academic purposes of PhD students. Therefore, my attempt will be to focus on something concrete and then try to show how the theoretical approach that I would like to discuss today, called as memory studies, may be used in literary studies. I have chosen to focus on memory studies, more specifically, cultural memory studies. First, I'll try to describe the salient features of the field of memory studies. Then I will elaborate on the relevance of memory to literary studies. And thirdly, I will try to illustrate the usefulness of this method using a few conceptual tools of memory studies to discuss some literary texts. My hope is that the field itself may be of interest to you, but in all likelihood, the field of your academic work may have already been decided. In that case, my hope is that this discussion will have an analogical utility in your work. Once again, I welcome questions, comments, and interventions from you any time of the lecture. If the audio poses any kind of technical problems, you can feel free to use the chat box, or you can even use the hand raise icon to intervene. I will try to finish my lecture within the, within the given time so that we can have enough time for a discussion. Now, memory as an object of academic inquiry is a very recent extract. Studying memory is really a very, very, in a very systematic and an institutional manner, is something that has developed in the past 100 years maximum. Now, it has associations with an approach to historiography that believes in the need to step beyond the usual sources in our understanding of the past. Somebody, maybe at the outset itself, I should distinguish between memory and history. See, it has been suggested that studying memory is an alternative approach to studying history, so as to avoid the official nature of history, which insists on public records and certain kind of linearity, etc. In a sense, memory studies seems to create space for those accounts of past that are left outside of history. Thus, typically, the field of memory studies includes studies of glossed over accounts of traumatic events as experienced by the victims, exploitation or oppression by dominant communities or nations, events that are, let us say, denied historical recognition, etc. Now, it includes studies of such phenomena as social, collective, or public memory, which examine not only the past, but also the very process of such remembering. Now, these concepts set up a contrast with notions of individual or personal memory by asserting that though it is an individual who remembers, the trigger for remembering, as well as the content and function of that memory, are public in nature. Although it is an individual who remembers, but it is the social context which makes those memories meaningful. Memory studies does not normally show much interest in individual memory or what what an individual remembers, that. But what it is interested in, why and how individuals engage in remembering the past, what kind of a meaningfulness are attributed to such memories, how and through what mediums these memories are passed on from generation to generation. Memory studies especially is interested in the long gone memories of collective nature and memories of long gone past. Now, in the last 3 or 4 decades, there has been a rush of activities within this area, and memory studies has emerged as an important interdisciplinary approach within the larger field of cultural studies. Memory studies aims at understanding social practices of remembering and socio-cultural processes that facilitate the negotiation with the past, which contribute to shaping collective identities, for example, and thus impact social action. It is common to trace the origins of memory studies to the scholarship on collective memory produced by Maurice Hoffox in his book on collective memory, which was published in 1925. Hoffox's argument, in a nutshell, is that individuals' memory is generated through interactions with the larger society. Now, his work, Hoffox's work, was basically sociological, and it focused on categories such as family and class. He argued that social processes greatly influence our memories of our own lifetimes, and further that they also strongly impact a society's common memories of the past. Therefore, shared memories become crucial for the identity of communities, be it families, religion, or social class. Now, Hoffox, his insights have been developed by scholars to show that the way we remember is related to the social discourses and practices of our society, of the society within which we live. One such social memory, which focuses on the social context of memory and examines how individuals recall the past in relation to prevalent narratives, forms of they are forms of commemoration. Now, the best illustration for this in our country is the commemoration of historical figures by naming roads, institutes, airports, universities after them. For example, Shivaji, Mahatma Gandhi have innumerable entities named after them, Ambedkar, etc., right? Nehru, etc. For example, look at the protracted claims and counterclaims to the memory of, let's say, Vallabhbhai Patel or Subhash Chandra Bose or even Bhagat Singh. The claims made on these historical figures through various memorial media, texts, monuments, films, etc., over a period of time would make for an interesting study in the changing narratives that are attached to past phenomena, to memory. It also reminds us that in memorial practices, truth of the past, the so-called the true history of facts, as it were, are never an issue. Memorial practices have more to do with, appropriations of the past for the present purposes, and thus fictional or imaginary elements may be a part of these appropriations. We are really not concerned most of the times with what the facts of matter were. We would like to remember things according to our own convenience. We tend to remember as we want rather than as they existed, isn't it? So that is the whole point here. Now, in these practices, just a second. Yeah, in this, so we in this sense, memorial practices narrativize or fictionalize past, invariably so. Hence, much of the memory studies takes the social constructionist approach. I'm sure we are all familiar with this notion of constructivism, which is something that, from around structuralism onwards, it is the very well-known approach in all the academic discourses. So that is, in society, truth and facts don't exist by themselves. It is the social phenomena, they're all constructions. These are all social phenomena constructed by people. That is the constructivist approach. Now, another point about social memory stressed in memory studies is that amnesia, that is forgetting, is as much a part of this social phenomena of remembering as memory itself is. So memory as well as remembering as well as forgetting are equally important phenomena in this whole business of memory studies. So memory studies is in fact interested in both what people remember and why, as well as what people forget and why. What a particular society or section of a society remembers involves also something that it wants to forget, but also that the same society or section of society may in the course of time alter the content of its memory. What it remembers is not permanent, it changes. Hello, yes, sir. Yeah, so like I was saying, memory studies is interested in examining this entire phenomena of remembering and forgetting, all of which have a social, political, and historical context. Let me even go to the extent of saying that behind this view of memorial dynamics is the idea that being remembered is more than a matter of being recorded in some archive. What is stored in an archive is merely a latent form of memory. For example, what is stored in a history book or in a monument, or in, let us say, in things like the paintings of Ajanta or the architecture of Ellora or whatever other places. They're all archives of one or the other kind. Or take even a history book. That is just the latent content of memory. And as long as no one pays any attention to an account of the past, it is effectively forgotten. Instead, memories are dependent on their being recalled in various media by later generations who find them meaningful for the time being, who may even find it their duty to keep them alive, but whose descendants may nevertheless proceed to forget them again, isn't it? And this is a kind of a continuous process as such. Now, another approach to memory studies focuses on popular memory and is influenced by the work done at Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. This is a very well-known, institution. This approach explores popular memory, especially in the form of oral history. Approaches associated with this outlook question the hegemonic narratives and aim to record the memories of subordinate groups in society. You will easily remember the work done by subaltern studies as an example of this. Think of Shahid Amin's Event Metaphor Memory, the book by Shahid Amin, which builds an alternative history of the Chaura Chauri event based on the family lore, folk songs, and other such non-historical resources of the subalterns in the sense of ordinary people. The interesting feature of this, as famously exemplified by the work done by Subaltern Studies Collective, is that in exploring popular memory, history steps out from the exalted halls of rational discourses and tries to construct from fictional narratives. Novels, poetry, ballads are all equally deployed, as resources. Very famously, some of the subaltern studies, Ranjit Guha, for example, in his early books, used all these quote unquote non-official resources, and using these non-official resources, they tried to reconstruct history from the perspective of the ordinary people, because official records tend to tell the story from governments or the rulers point of view, or the dominant classes point of view. Now, so I must point to the interesting phenomena of folk songs such as povadas or other narrative songs that celebrate public figures of the past. Very often, what history memorialized and what is memorialized by the folk songs are very, very different. We must remember that the earliest celebratory accounts of Shivaji are found not in history books, but in povadas. In Karnataka, there was a regional ruler called Madakari Nayaka, who has been extolled as a brave commander and ruler. But the folk songs of the region are silent on him, indicating that the people's memory of the same ruler is quite different. In different regions in South, the accounts given by folk narratives about Tipu Sultan vary. Some celebrate him, some denigrate him, reminding us that rulers ultimately can be good to some, even when they are bad to some others. An important development of Half-Fox ideas is undertaken by Aleida and Jan Assmann, who introduced the concept of cultural memory. According to them, the sense of belongingness to a distinct society or cultural community is obtained by an individual across generations through socialization and customs. Cultural memory, for them, refers to that collective knowledge obtained through customs, practices, objects, rituals, and so on. The everyday activities within communities that guides the individuals to repeat past social practices over generations. Jan Assmann and his partner Aleida Assmann define the concept of cultural memory as distinct from the everyday memory, which they use the term communicative memory to refer to that. Cultural memory, according to them, has its fixed point. Its horizon does not change with the passing of time. These fixed points are the fateful events of the past, whose memory is maintained through various cultural formations, texts and rites and monuments, and institutional communication, such as recitation and certain observances, certain practices. So, for example, you can imagine something like, August 15th, how it is, the memory is perpetuated through certain kinds of textual, certain kinds of rites that we perform, certain kinds of monuments that we have. Similarly, there is a institutional communication. We use films, performances, and songs, etc., etc., and observances that we do on 15th August, of hoisting the flag and all that. Through all this, the memory of India's achieving independence from the British rule is in a way, perpetuated, isn't it? So that is a way in which we can understand this idea of, now communicative memory, according to the cultural studies, the cultural memory theorists, does not have a cultural character, and it relates to the intimate details, whereas cultural memory refers to that which is remote from the everyday memory and refers back in time beyond personal familiarity. So if, for example, none of us today were present when the India achieved its independence and 15th August, on 15th August 1947, none of us were present. So we don't have any familiarity with those events. So they are not our memory. But yet, in our mind, it continues. Or let us even think of other ones. Like, for example, it is said that Diwali has something to do with Rama returning to Ayodhya. Now, look at that. How myth also participates in shaping, molding our memories. So we were not there. We were not present when all this happened. But if they happened the way we today choose to remember them, even that is something that we have to, examine, study, etc. So this is how societies make choices to remember things in particular ways, to remember certain events for repeatedly, etc. Now, communicative memory is closely related to what Fox understood as collective memory. Its temporal framework is limited, just a couple of generations, maybe spanning not more than 100 years. It relies on everyday communication, but by definition, it is closely connected to those familiar with the event itself. So I remember everything that was part of my own life, my own, what I have seen, my own experiences. Whereas cultural memory, on the other hand, refers to events from a distant past, not by living memory, because memory of past events is sustained through cultural formations or through forms of commemoration. Commemoration is the word that, enacts this idea of, memorializing and continuing that memory. Epics are a good example of cultural memory. In every society, including our society, memories of mythical characters have been turned into everyday practices such as naming. You see, the way in which we use names in among Hindus, for example, it is largely taken from these epics, isn't it? And this is true of even other communities, other religious groups, etc. So you have Rama, for example, is a very common name in many communities in India. If you go to Rajasthan, for example, a lot of people have the same name, Ram, something or the other Ram, Sukhi Ram, Dukhi Ram, Atma Ram, so on and so forth. Now, religious rituals, festivals, all these, are connected, as it were. So take the example of the legend of Bali, a king famed to have done good to farmers, isn't it? Bali Raja, the king of farmers, it seems. In parts of South India, Bali is celebrated in a variety of festivals. Onam in Kerala, Diwali in Karnataka, etc. Basavanna is a historical figure from 12th century Karnataka, the leader of a group of radicals who sought to defy social hierarchy by applying the notion of oneness of all humans in front of God. Today, Basavanna is a very important figure in a number of social registers of memory, which includes caste register as well as caste opposing register, spiritual as well as secular and radical. So Basavanna's compositions called vachanas, they are also appropriated in support of these specific forms of memorializing. I can give you another example which many of you also might know. Look at the example of Bhagat Singh, or for that matter Subhash Chandra Bose. These are all figures that various kinds of people are appropriating today, isn't it? So the point is that is how societies tend to deal with their past. Reality, truth, etc., facts become less important, because memory is not so much about the past. Memory is more about the present, or memory is more about how we want to build our future in the present. So for that purposes, memory is deployed as in that sense. It is very, very political. Now, across these diverse formulations in memory studies, the common element is their view of the intersection between culture and memory at social and individual levels. Practice of remembering, or the meaning of memory, is seen in terms of its constructedness. Memory is also seen as mediated by cultural, social, political, and media apparatuses. The focus on constructedness and mediation calls our attention to the narrative dimension of memory. Hence, memory studies addresses how memory is designed as and accessed through narratives. This also would lead us into the relation between memory and literature. Literature is one of the memorial media through which societies construct, preserve, and recollect their past. So now let me turn to the relevance of memory in literary studies. Here, my attempt first is to show the connections between memory and literature, thus advocating the research potential in memory studies. Then, in the third part of the lecture, I will try to tools within memory studies. Let me just have a bit of water. If history is the life lived, cultural memory is what lives on. History is related to life that has been lived, in the sense completed. It's an image of the completed, and memory is an image of the continued. Cultural memory is an encoding of practices in repeatable forms, whether direct or indirect, material or immaterial. It's a group phenomena, even though it is embodied by and in the individuals. Importantly, cultural memory is necessarily in the form of representation. In other words, it is always through representation that cultural memory continues to be perpetuated. Memory may be preserved, maintained, and communicated in any society through various types of media: customs, festivals, statues, public buildings, institutes, and, as we very well know, texts. We must remember that these media are deployed as part of the socio-political contingencies. Recent controversy about the renaming of, recent in the sense, not very recent, some, I think, a year ago or so, there was this controversy about renaming of Khel Ratna Award. It used to be called Rajiv Gandhi Awards or some such thing, Rajiv Khel Ratna Award or something, and it has been renamed, something like that. It only reminds us about the complexity of public memory. There can be a conflict as to which memory is more important. Now, literary texts are an important space to discover memories of the past, be it autobiographies or other genres, be it communicative memory, social memory, popular memory, or cultural memory. Literary texts engage in preserving and communicating memory, revising, rememorializing them, or even attempting to change and reconfigure them. Now, I'm going to, in my presentation about literature and memory, I'm going to use the work done by Earl and Nunning, two major scholars in the field of literature and memory. And their work on cultural memory and narratives is very, very useful to us. According to Earl and Nunning, the relation between literature and memory can be systematized as literature's memory, memory in literature, and literature as a medium of memory. Literature's memory, in the sense, literature also is a memorial practice. In the sense, it also exists through memory. For example, sonnet, or take, for example, the English, what we in India are familiar with within English studies as sonnet, right? So, in order to write a sonnet, you should remember the practice of writing sonnet that has existed for several centuries, or writing an epic, or writing a povada, or writing a kirtan, whatever it is. There is a certain drama, for example. So these are all, already pre-existing forms of literature. So in a way, literature is its own memory. Secondly, the content of literature also may be memory. It may deal with several, it may deal with events and practices and various habits and etc., which are not only one person's but a whole society's, a whole community's memories. And finally, literature can become a medium of memory. So at these three levels, we can study memory in relation to literature. First, let us focus on the issue of literature's memory. Now, literary works provide an important bridge between generations. recollecting texts composed or written in earlier periods is an integral part of cultural remembrance. Literature establishes a memory of its own in the form of intertextual relations that give a new cultural life to old texts. Isn't it? So if you come across, some in a poem written today, the word Chakravyuha or something, Dharma Yuddha or something, there's an allusion, a question of literature's own memory. Other literary texts are in that sense, here, remember. Literary genres represent a form of memory internal to literature, but it continues for long periods of time. Considering that epics go back thousands of years, even before, they go back even before AD, right? And even today, it is an active genre. We understand how literary memory is very long. Genres represent literature as primarily mnemotechnics. Remember that when you write a literary work, you're operating within a form that is old, sometimes very old. You write a poem, lyric poem is a very old form, very, very old form. Thousands of years, people have been writing lyrics. You're always writing in a form already used, thus continuing something inherited. May go back thousands of years, a drama, and cultures have retained these forms and have nurtured them. It is interesting to note here that although genres appear to be very rigid, a memorial technique going back in time, it's also true that they are flexible and travel a lot. They're flexible in the sense they allow the new practitioners to mold them, change them. Similarly, they travel in the sense that, societies of different periods and societies of different places easily take, foreign genres. Haiku, Japanese form, India easily adopted. Novel, European form, India easily adopted. And Indian forms have been adopted elsewhere, so on and so forth. That is, they're open to receive and wear new clothes as it. Now, secondly, retelling of literary texts. It represents not only memory, but also form of intertextuality. See, during neoclassical period, you will remember that this kind of a retelling was called as imitation, and it was something that accounted for a very large number of literary production during that time. All the major writers, take for example, Samuel Johnson's famous poem London. It's an imitation of Juvenal's third satire. It means that it was an altered rendering, even including original lines in translation. Similarly, literary phenomena also informs the pre-modern literature in India. When in every Indian languages, stories from Ramayana and Mahabharata were rewritten. Like Dhaneshwari is supposed to be the, a retelling of Gita. And in every languages, you have a version of, and not only in traditional, but even in modern, literature, in the form of drama, in the form of novel, in the form of, contemporary poetry. Also, we have, these ancient texts such as epics being retold. Thirdly, the internal memory of literature. That also covers the literary texts circulate across space as well as across time. Imagine how Aesop's fables have traveled across languages. Isn't it? We realize how literary phenomena is sustained, or Panchatantra stories, for example, through translation. You may even think of translation into other media, films, etc., or games in the recent past. Now, all these forms of literary memory include commemoration, celebration, as well as contestation, important. Thus, we have translate. Even if you look at Ramayana, there are so many versions of Ramayana. Why are there so many versions of Ramayana? One is celebration, another is contestation. One account of the story of Rama is retold to insert new elements into it, contesting some details that somebody else has told. So in that sense, people tend to have this kind of a appropriation of these earlier texts. Now, thus we have translated texts that commemorate retellings that we celebrate, such as Vishal Bharadwaj, Shakespeare renderings, the 3 films that he has made, very famous ones, and famously retelling Shakespeare's stories. Omkara, Haidar, and there's one more. I think Makbul must be the third one. Or retellings that contest, such as Dryden's version of Shakespeare, John Dryden. Such other key texts also as retellings that involve a form of contestation, celebration as well as contestation. So another famous example of contestation at the level of genre is Rajarau's Kantapura. It is a novel that was published in 1938. You may have heard of this novel. Although I call it a novel, at least a section of it aims to be different from the English or European model of novel writing known at the time. Rajarau uses the preface to call our attention to the style in which the novel is written and the rationale behind it. He says something to the effect that the telling of this story has not been easy because one has to convey in a language that is not one's own the spirit that is one's own. He says something to that effect. So, Kantapura as a novel, deep and the European genre of novel. The stylistic feature of this needs to be viewed not only as difference in relation to novelistic discourse, but also as a deployment of cultural memory of the native culture, especially in relation to 2 aspects: the narrative style or technique, which differs from the dominant Western novelistic style of its time and employs what the preface describes as the Indian narrative style. Secondly, the use of a long winding sentence structure which imitates such acts of literary remembrance contribute in a very specific manner to the ongoing production and reproduction of cultural memory, as well as to our reflection on that. Now, exploration of the internal memory of literature is carried out in academic research under the rubric of influence studies, genre studies, comparative literature. New possibilities open up if we approach through the lens of memory studies. Let us look at the second link between literature and memory that I mentioned earlier as memory in literature. The representation of memory in literary texts functions at various levels. At the level of genre, technique, motive, characters, plot elements, images, symbols, etc. At many, many levels. Autobiography as a memory genre raises distinct questions about the status of memory and forgetting that is textualized. Many writers of autobiography point out that they haven't presented everything that happened in their life. They say it openly, isn't it? Now, we can go into some of these questions in the discussion, because there are many examples that I'm sure you might also think up. But we also have a type of writing in novel that too is autobiographical. The most obvious example being Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, or James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. These are all very well known. Or D.H. Lawrence's, Sons and Lovers. Here also the issue of memory becomes complicated as fictional elements enter into it. But we need to think that the fictionality of memory in autobiography and the autobiographical novel are very different. Hayden White, in fact, has shown us how every narrative is subject to fictionality at one or the other level. In that sense, neither an autobiography nor even a history text are free of this element of fictionality. Memory also appears as a technique in literature such as stream of consciousness. It's important to remember here that though often memory is projected in literary texts is personal, they symbolically or metonymically represent collective memory. For example, while we read D.H. Lawrence's novels, say The Rainbow, taking its autobiographical elements into account, we might say, oh, these are all the experiences of D.H. Lawrence as a boy or as a young man. At another level, some of the memory are about the experiences of the entire community, not only that person, the transformation that that particular region, that particular village, that particular community has undergone during that period. And that is what cultural studies scholars, Christopher Caldwell, for example, especially, has pointed out. Another very important aspect is how the very process of literary production refers to the act of remembering. I think I don't need to go beyond the widely known interpretation of Wordsworth's poem Daffodils to explain this, isn't it? All of you remember how the poem Daffodils, speaks about Wordsworth's very definition of poetry, in fact, about remembering and reproducing, remembering and reflecting, and then, creating the poem. Now, many texts, in fact, self-consciously reflect on their production and the role of memory in it. Consider the opening of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or even that of Wuthering Heights. If we take the example of Rushdie's Midnight's Children also, we notice that such a reflection on the memory in Rushdie's Midnight's Children, it is there throughout. Every now and then, there is a kind of a self-reflection on what is remembered correctly or what is remembered wrongly, and then correcting that mistake there, etc. So that kind of a self-reflection is self-reflexiveness is very much a part of that particular novel. And not only that novel, many other novels, even for that matter, it is something that we see in a number of postmodernist novels as well. Sometimes it's even used to project the narrator's unreliability. Amitav Ghosh's Shadow Lines also reflects on the act of remembering and its importance. Now, let us turn to the third link I mentioned between literature and memory. That is, literature as a medium of memory. Now, works of literature help produce collective memories by recollecting the past in the form of narratives. The obvious forms of memory that we find constituting literary works are personal memory or historical events and identity narratives. For example, we have numerous novels recounting various events related to India's freedom struggle. For example, partition novels. At the level of events, we have a novelistic discourse called partition novel, but at the level of characters, we have a variety of Gandhi novels, reinventing historical Gandhi in many forms, including the novel that I mentioned a little while ago. This one, what is that? Raja Rao's novel Kantapur. That also has a Gandhi figure. Now, we may briefly consider Indian historical novel as it emerged in 19th and early 20th century. We notice that a number of novels attempt to reconstruct past memory, such as that of Rana Pratap, Shivaji, Chhatrapati Shivaji, and others in such a way as to portray the glorious heritage of India and its present ignominy being ruled by foreigners. Now, examples that come to my mind right now are the novels such as Martanda Varma. Now, during this period, even social memory deployed. The story is fictional, but social practices are historical. Such novels also tended to follow this logic of past glory and present decadence. This also we see. But over and above the works that have memory as the plot line, literary works may reveal memory at micro levels and metonymical. For example, literary works may reveal food habits, recipes, clothing practices, economic structures, farming practices, etc. And these may reveal to us aspects of the society being depicted. There is an archaeological recuperation of memory, as it were. When we read, for example, Keats's Grecian Urn, Ode to Grecian Urn, we learn something about the society in which the urn was created 2000 years ago. Hence, Keats calls it a historian. In Kantapura also, early pages have descriptions of the trade that is the backbone of the villages, but merely in the form of a description of the carts that plied to and from Kantapura. Coetzee's novel Disgrace, South African novelist Coetzee, his novel Disgrace engages with South African post-apartheid discourses about truth and reconciliation. So in this sense, it provides a mimesis of cultural memory, a kind of an imitation of cultural memory in the form of a fictional story, metonymically as it were, about a man who refuses to confess and be forgiven for things done in the past. Now, by offering a parallel fictional story focused on an individual and his private life, Coetzee's novel reflects critically on the construction of cultural memory in society at large. Now, we can also reconstruct some aspects of cultural memory metonymically. That is, experiences of one character or a family or a whole group may lead us allegorically to understand the social and economic dimensions of that society. It's a kind of a symptomatic reading. If we take Shakespeare's King Lear, it will be clear. If, for example, Marxists read King Lear and interpret Shakespeare as representing the feudal order which is under attack of the newly emerging pre-capitalist mercantile order, represented by Goneril, Reagan, and their husbands, as against Cordelia and her husband, King of France. They are on the side of feudal system. This reading takes the plot line symptomatically to historical memory. Now, though I can't remember the details now, but there are some very interesting readings of novels in the works of Ranjit Guha. Partha Chatterjee, for example, does a very detailed, elaboration of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's novels. Even what is his name? As Kaviraj, Sudipta Kaviraj also. There's a book on that. And Dipesh Chakravarti has reads writers like Thakur, Rabindranath Tagore, right? So in this way, this is something that is, we find many examples of. Now I turn to the third part of this presentation. Let me see if anybody has asked any questions before I go any further. No, I don't think there are any questions right now. Okay. Now let me turn to the third part of this presentation. I hope I have another 10-15 minutes to present this. Now here I will take up 3 conceptual tools for literary analysts as a brief demonstration in front of you about how memory studies can be deployed in actual literary studies. I've already given you some examples. I'll give you a more concrete example. Now, one of the conceptual tool I will demonstrate here and speak about is the revivalistic approach. Another is rememorialization and curative approach. These are the 3 conceptual tools about memory that I would like to discuss. Now, it's a tentative and partial kind of a demonstration. Obviously, I mean, this is not a research article that I'm writing as such. It's just a lecture. So it's a bit tentative, but it's brief also because of the restriction of time that we have. Now, literature does not have a single pre-given role in memorial dynamics, nor do literary works have only one cultural afterlife. The same literary work may serve both to confirm and consolidate the sense of a common heritage, and depending on who is doing the reading, to arouse interest in the heritage and experiences of other groups. To take the point even further, it is arguable that making uninterested parties interested in the experience of others may be as much a key to the construction of cultural memories of one's family or the experiences of the ethnic group with which one usually identifies. Now, literary works, by virtue of their poetic and fictional properties, may have a distinctive role to play in reawakening eroded, forgotten memories in later generations. And there are many examples for this, where literary works have played a very historical role in reminding of the cultural heritage of a particular community. Thus, one of the dynamics of literary configuration of memory is to revive that which is lost or forgotten. Now, in the context of colonized societies or oppressed societies, this particular function of revival of memory takes a political urgency. You should see how African American communities use literature and songs as a form of preserving their cultural heritage. Now, I call this revivalistic approach. And that's my first conceptual tool to demonstrate in front of you how memory can be deployed in literary studies. Memory deployed for revivalistic purposes, to reviving, the memory of some past heritage or history, etc. Memory as a kind of a nostalgia. Now, it may be positive, it may be negative. I'm not here to judge. I'm here only to present how in literary texts memory sometimes is deployed in a nostalgic manner. In some cases, the urge for revival is productive. In some, it might be militant. Some of this may even reveal an element of nostalgia for the past, which they seek to re-establish in the present. So here, I want to give a couple of examples to clarify what I mean. Take Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. It's a novel that was written explicitly to counter the colonial representations of Africa and its traditions. Achebe has, in fact, written elsewhere in his essays about this. In this novel, Achebe wants to not only show the colonizing culture's violence in the later chapters, but also to assert that his own culture has its merits. In fact, we can read this novel against Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which had portrayed Africa as not only dark, but also dumb. Achebe's novel, thus, may be seen as deploying cultural memory of Africans, specifically the Swahili tribe of Nigeria, as that is the locale of that novel, as a form of asserting identity. And we will find many, many examples for this kind of a work all over, including in India, as well as in many other parts of the world. Alex, what is his name? Roots. Alex Haley's Roots is a very famous, kind of autobiographical text, which goes back to reviving memories of the past, right? Now, let me take another Indian English novel. This is by, it's a novel called Inside the Haveli by Rama Mehta. Some of you may have heard because sometimes it is prescribed for PG classes in India. Now, it's a good example of the deployment of cultural memory in a nostalgic mode. Now, the title itself indicates it is the Haveli lifestyle inside the Haveli, right? It is the Haveli lifestyle that is invoked by the narrative. The novel richly portrays the cultural memory of the Haveli dwellers as it has existed for a long time. The Haveli culture itself is recreated as it, through all the details, not only the story, but also the descriptions, the details, small little things. When a character engages in doing something as part of the action of the novel, it is not only advancing the storyline, but it is also revealing to us a culture. That is the point I'm trying to make. So I see the deployment of cultural memory in this novel as revivalistic because we see nostalgia for the Haveli life, which is defended in the novel by presenting it as constituting a more valuable way of life. We see this also in the way Malgudi is constructed by R.K. Narayan in his fictional works. Link between literature and memory, on the one hand, refers to non-referential content of textual material that portray explicitly or implicitly the operations of memory. On the other hand, this link can also refer to the narratives that individuals or communities create about their past as part of their construction of identity. In this particular role, there is, to the link between literature and memory, a fictional element, as they tend to be imaginative reconstructions of the past from within their current context. The narrator, as accessing the past, is also involved in the act of bringing order into his or her memories, imposing meaning on a slice from the past. It is in this meaning-making aspect that we realize that memory is never merely a recovery of what is past, but a recreation. In other words, we have to understand this very clearly, that memory studies is not saying that we can simply, go back in time and look at the past as if through a, transparent glass. No, memory is always something that is a reconstruction. It's a creation. It's a kind of a recreation. It can never really be accurate. So in this sense, literature does not only record memory, but sometimes engages in what in my research I have called as rememorialization. Literary texts may have a role to play in arousing interest in histories which are not one's own, in the history of groups with which one has hitherto not identified. When we read, for example, somebody else's, history, or about somebody else's life. So, for example, when we Indians read about, when we read African literature or American literature or something, then, or European, whichever, when we read them, we understand their culture, etc., their history, their memories. So this suggests the importance of seeing literary texts not just as channels for perpetuating certain memorial traditions, but also as the source of new traditions and the means for broadening the horizons of what one considers as one's own heritage. Now, literature plays a role in transferring memories, not just between individuals belonging to the same community, but also across groups. This was presumably what Jeffrey Hartman had in mind when he proposed that the arts and literature in particular serve to remind us that the heritage of the past is pluralistic and diverse. So it also alerts us to avoid the pitfalls of identity politics within memory studies. That is, to avoid assuming that all recalls of memory or all instances of remembering take place only within and for the purposes of one's own identity group, to assert one's own identity group, to glorify one's own identity group, caste, class, or whatever, religious or national or whatever other ethnic identity group. In fact, literature gives us many examples of otherness, alterity, examples of facing the other, or even in some cases, subjecting oneself to the other. I find Ananthamurthy's celebrated novel, Samskara, to be a very good example of this. Now, to extend what T.S. Eliot says about the artist writing with the whole tradition within him, one may say that all writings tend to be rewritings of sorts. They directly or indirectly reflect, revise, and refract upon earlier narratives. Every writing reconfigures memories to renegotiate the present socio-political, situations and realities. The fact that literary works foreground certain memories while marginalizing others indicates that the role of literature is not just a matter of recalling or recording or stabilizing, but also of selecting certain memories and preparing them for future cultural life as stories. Poetic and narrative forms have an important role to play in this process of making memorable, something that we have to remember. I think it's already 4:30, so I should perhaps, curtail my presentation by jumping to conclusion. So the discussion of memory and literary studies I have so far presented before you around 3 conceptual terms stresses the importance of an interdisciplinary approach which takes into account the various media, discourses, and cultural spheres through which memories are conveyed and transformed. Secondly, the cultural longevity of this, portable monuments, as somebody has put it, the literary texts are kind of portable monuments. It shows the importance of a non-linear approach to the evolution of cultural memory, which would allow for different temporalities and for discontinuous traditions. Thirdly, the complexity of the deployment of memory as literary artifacts points to the need for a further elaboration of a poetics of, memorability based on the principle that literary form may be constitutive of memory rather than any simple claim for authenticity or truth as such. So with that, I conclude my, few reflections on literature and memory. I invite you to comment or ask your questions either by using the chat option or by using the audio of Zoom, and leave the rest to the organizers. Thank you.